Ben Uri came to us. They were interested in the work. I think obviously there are certain elements in the work which resonate with their, the kind of the idea of the history in the work that it alludes to certain events in the 20th century. I think that thinking about the idea of Jewish immigrants to London, I think the reason that it's kind of become maybe even more of consideration now is because in some senses there is a kind of a return to a kind of a focus upon immigration as a negative effect. There's a kind of a core political sort of position in the work. It's just a general kind of how to live and think without being a fascist. And I think that the work is kind of deeply antagonistic to some of the kind of the dark underbelly thinking which promotes purist thoughts about race, thoughts that are antagonistic towards the idea of immigration. I think we're obviously interested in the relationship between capitalism and fascism, and I suppose that that is necessarily of interest to the curators at Ben Uri. My father's English and my mother is Greek Cypriot. So I do have an experience of what it is to be a member of an immigrant family. And I think especially now, the heightened suspicion of immigrants makes it perhaps more important now to focus upon the positive side of being an immigrant. I think, but even just kind of thinking back, thinking about the specificity of this work and thinking about the kind of National Socialist ideology, which is to do with the idea that somehow you can draw somehow pure demarcations between sort of races, which is patently idiotic, and it's also kind of like a dumb idea to think that somehow there are indigenous populations. There's no such thing as an indigenous population. Everyone's an immigrant. Everyone comes from somewhere else. I think best example is like Nigel Farage. It's superb. How far back has he set the limit of being an immigrant, given his parents are German, I think? That's great. There's an amazing kind of sort of hideous piece of cretin thinking. I am sensitive to the idea of just the idea of a Jewish museum taking on the mantle of having to be the perennial outsider. That the way, that it necessarily has to kind of connect to the world in a way which is always as though it presents itself as the constant exile. But although I do sort of think that there's a kind of a harmonic restitution between being an immigrant and being perhaps an artist, in as much as that you are by the nature of your activity on the periphery. I would be less interested in just simply a kind of a soft interest in identity and a soft interest in the idea of immigration or what it means to be a kind of the suppressed community of a society. I think that I would be much more aggressive about my analysis and understanding of that. I think the question of a Jewish museum, I guess, widening the boundaries of its interests to include other, the sense of immigration, cultural immigration. As far as I'm concerned, there are debts to be paid that haven't been. And the question of Nazi ideology is not just simply to do with the specificity of one moment in history. It's also to do with the ideology of the Enlightenment, the notion of progress, the notion of presuming that the superiority of humanity over over other things. So that I suppose that our interest in the idea of Nazi ideology is also a forensic examination of the notion of enlightenment and some of the idealistic principles that are enshrined in its notion of progress. Part of the problems of the conditions of art is that, you know, it's only a sublimation of an aggressive instinct, perhaps. You know, it's, you know, we can make all of this work which alludes to sort of, you know, having kind of, you know, not just critical feelings about the world, but probably malevolent feelings about the world. But the only artist I can think who's had any kind of relative success in terms of actually having an effect over their audience is when a Richard Serra piece fell on someone and squashed them. I mean, it would be nice to think that your work could have such a kind of an actual first-order effect, but, you know, one has to limit oneself to the kind of the melodramas of work like this. You know, I mean, I don't think I got into making art because I was interested in some kind of, you know, bourgeois activity, sort of, you know, kind of you know, aimed at making kind of pretty objects for people to buy. I mean, you know, I think in some senses the parasitical nature of kind of having these things exist in a world that's kind of usually defined by things which are motivated by notions of beauty and prettiness and kind of style and you know, I think that's kind of that's probably it's the best we can do, but it's also probably a measure of the impotence of political art. You know, this is probably the sum total of what's possible. As I said, you know, these things are not acting out kind of, you know, these are not confessional works of art. They don't respond, they're not the latent manifestation of latent sort of desires to do with autobiography. These are things which are considerations about how we think the world is. I think the point about me and Dinos deciding to work together from the outset was a way of actually denying any way in which the viewer could mistake the work for being autobiographical, because if there's two people involved, you know, it's automatically duplicitous. It cannot be something to do with a revelation of one's soul or the truth in one's ego or some confessional outburst. And these things are kind of decided upon by two people who are in the world. You know, our approach to making art is that we think that the work of art exists prior to its production, which means to say that the work is something to do with the language that's possible rather than some kind of originary process that we come up with. You know, if you go and look at a Franz Klein painting or Jackson Pollock painting, the reason they're good is because they are good and they're not good. There's a thing called a Gestalt switch, which is the duck-rabbit picture. You know, it's a thing that looks like a rabbit and then it looks like a duck, and it can never be a duck and a rabbit at the same time. It's one or the other. And I think that operates in how, when you look at the Jackson Pollock painting, for a moment it kind of congeals into the image that it is. It kind of has the power of being the optical thing that it is, and then it flicks back to being the ridiculous nature of what it is, which is just a wooden support, some canvas and some chucked paint. And it flickers between the two things. And I think just through the very nature of being exposed to the idea of something which is not one thing and not another thing, the philosophical impact of that has an implication over everything else that you see. I suppose what I'm saying is that if something oscillates between one thing and another, then you know, the implication for that is that one has to understand, you know, that even within a simple relationship between conscious thinking and unconscious thinking, that the gap between the two should allow some moment of reflecting upon the equality of the unconscious and the conscious, and to not always follow the tyranny of the conscious. You know, because that's where the kind of notion of morality and ethics resides. You know, and that somehow these things, these kind of fixed, stable thinking is not necessarily the best kind of thinking. I have a hardwired indifference to speaking positively about any institution. You know, I think the good thing I can say about Ben Uri is that they're interested in doing a show with us, and my interest in the project is limited to the work that I can make for it, and the lorry that will turn up The shutters will go up, the people will come in with white gloves, pick the work up, stick it in the van, take it away, and we'll put the show on. I mean, that's it for me. Because my interest in all of this stuff has to be limited, it has to exist within the autonomy of the work and not any of the other bullshit that goes around it.